Fabricamos talento. Fabricamos innovación. Y, cómo no, sostenibilidad. Fabricamos una nueva economía. Y un mundo nuevo, en 3D, por supuesto. Pero sobre todo, fabricamos futuro. Y es que fabricamos empleo para más de 137.000 trabajadores. Fabricamos oportunidades globales de negocio en un espacio de más de 10 millones de metros cuadrados. Y fabricamos servicios de vanguardia y ventajas competitivas para más de 175 empresas. Consorcio de la Zona Franca. Fabricamos oportunidades para tu futuro.
Welcome to D-Factory, the factory that develops talent, technology, innovation, and of course in the heart of Barcelona. After all, D-Factory is consolidating Barcelona as a European capital of development for Industry 4.0, for digitalization, for transformation, creating 1,500 direct jobs and 5,000 indirect jobs in the city, close to the metro, the harbour and the airport. And promoted by the Consorcio de la Zona Franca de Barcelona.
Now it's the time of changes. Now is the time to move on. This is the time for solutions. Feel the motion. BNEW is born. BNEW, none of you. Now I'm connected to you. BNEW, none of you. BNEW will do it for you. This is the time for solutions. BNEW is for you.
Buenos días, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo estáis? Bienvenidas y bienvenidos a BNEW Mobility. Es el último día, a mí me ha pasado volando. Hoy ya es jueves, estamos en D-Factory, este edificio increíble donde pasan tantas cosas como en BNEW. Este es el nodo de innovación 4.0 más importante del sur de Europa y BNEW es un megaevento organizado por el Consorcio de la Zona Franca de Barcelona y es lo más del nuevo curso. Desde septiembre, bueno, el evento híbrido más importante de la nueva economía es este, BNEW. Y por aquí hemos visto estos días que han pasado, pues bueno, ya os lo dije al principio, los profesionales que mueven los hilos del sector de la movilidad en todo el mundo. Y nos han contado muchas cosas y muy interesantes, pero todavía nos quedan muchas porque hoy tenemos por delante 5 sesiones muy interesantes. Bueno, vamos a ello. Para empezar este jueves con un toque de aventura, os proponemos viajar a África, pero no para hacer un safari, sino para responder a la llamada que hace el sector de la aviación africana para poder subsanar sus carencias en materia de infraestructuras. Mirad, el gobierno africano espera la ayuda del sector privado para desarrollar su infraestructura de transporte aéreo y aumentar su capacidad, incluyendo la construcción y también la rehabilitación de aeropuertos y nuevas rutas aéreas que apoyen el crecimiento del tráfico aéreo y mejoren también y mucho que lo necesitan sus servicios. ¿Cómo podemos acomodar este crecimiento, mantener las operaciones manejables, proporcionar una excelente experiencia a los pasajeros y aprovechar al máximo la infraestructura sostenible que ya tienen? En el siguiente panel vamos a explorar el mercado aeroportuario de África y sus múltiples oportunidades de negocio. Y al frente de esta expedición tenemos a Khalil Slimani, experto en cooperación internacional y desarrollo empresarial, jefe de desarrollo corporativo en la Asociación de Cámaras de Comercio del Mediterráneo, ASCAME. Khalil, bienvenido, ¿cómo estamos?
Gracias.
Bienvenido a BNEW Mobility. Yo decía, hay oportunidades oportunidades, es un terreno de oportunidades. Te pregunto a ti directamente, que tú sabes muchas cosas. ¿Hay oportunidades reales para los inversores y los emprendedores en el sector de la aviación africana?
Pues como lo has comentado justo antes, todo el sector con carencias ofrece oportunidades de desarrollo y de mejora. Y con los expertos que tenemos hoy en día vamos a intentar tratar esta temática.
Pues vamos a tomar nota, y emprendedores y emprendedoras, tomar nota, porque este es un terreno de muchas oportunidades. Adelante.
Good morning, everyone. We'll switch to English to have this panel around airports in Africa and the market that it represents. It's not only airports, it's the whole air transportation market that is involved in this industry. I'll count on the expertise of two relevant voices of the African development and the air transport development infrastructures in the continent and in Europe. Air transport is one of the most appropriate mode of transport for Africa. It is a vast continent, 30 million square kilometers, a rugged terrain, and 850 million inhabitants are concentrated in scattered population centers. The impracticality and the inadequacy of the surface transports like maritime or road, rail, and river transportations in the continent makes the air market for the African continent really relevant. The development of this air transport market will enable African states to open up and develop their economies, their geography, strengthen international and commercial relations with other countries, stimulate foreign currency inflows, make a growth on the tourism sector, and also push the exports of agriculture and the supply of medicine and food. So, like in many other sectors in the African continents, and as we see when we discuss African aspects, there's a huge potential. There's a huge lack of infrastructure and of services provided by the African airport market. And we are counting right now on your expertise to tell us what can help us reduce the gap with the rest of the world. So let's focus this question to Mr. Oscar Oliver. Oscar Oliver is an architect at the beginning. He developed his career around the air transportation market, being the commercial director of the airport. The Aeroports de Catalunya, which is the holding, managing the airports in the region of Catalonia. What are the key aspects that you saw in your field and that are still lacking in the African continent?
Thank you very much for this opportunity. And thank you very much for the opportunity to speak about the African airports. Because normally when we speak about the African airports, we speak about the infrastructure. It's true, the infrastructure is very important, but also we need to consider other aspects. Firstly, I would like to introduce a topic, is the creation of the single African air transport market. The single African air transport market is a real opportunity in order to generalize the transport in the continent between all the countries of Africa. At this moment, just 28 countries have signed this convention. So there are a lot of work to do in order to have a unique market in Africa concerning the air transport. The second question, the second topic, in my opinion, it's very important too, is to try to liberalize the bilateral agreements of air transportation. Okay? You know, the bilateral agreements of air transport are the essential tool in order to establish a direct air connection between two countries. And in Africa at this moment, these bilateral agreements are too rigid. Okay? So second question, to liberalize the bilateral agreements. Probably Africa is one of the most important markets for air transport in terms of the development at this moment, because in 2018, just 214 million passengers flew from Africa to other continents or flew inside the continent. Just 214 passengers. It's one of the markets less developed at this moment, but there is a real opportunity in order to introduce new services such as the low-cost carriers. At this moment, the presence of the low-cost carriers are really low in the African continent. So for the next years, probably we will see how the low-cost carriers will operate more and more in Africa. With this introduction of the low-cost carriers, probably we will see also the creation of new routes between the countries of the African continent. So the capacity to fly inside the continent will increase.
Oh, that's one of the points. If you travel a little bit in Africa and between the African countries, that's something that is really funny to experience. That, for example, to go from Casablanca to Addis Abeba, I had to go through London, Paris, or Rome in order to get to another African countries. So do you think this single African air market will go more on the regulatory frameworks or on the provision of elements that the private sector needs to tap into the sector?
The example to follow is the European market. So with the liberalization of the 80s and 90s, has the proof that the introduction of new competitors in the air transport sector, in the air transport market, is a possibility. So, you know, in Europe, during the 80s and the 90s, you saw how the low-cost carriers developed its activity. I think this is a possibility also for Africa. So with the introduction of the competition between the flag carriers and the new operators such as the low-cost carriers, the possibility of the creation of new air routes is a reality. So in my opinion, for the next years, we will see how we will have more competition in the air transport in Africa, and finally, the benefits of this is the creation of new air routes inside the continent, okay?
And one small last question. What would be the key point that has to be improved from the African regulatory authorities?
Yes, is to try to liberalize the bilateral agreements in terms of the traffic rights. Okay. The traffic rights is the essential topic, is the most important topic when you want to have a real liberalization of the bilateral agreements in the different countries of Africa. So the first step is to try to liberalize the traffic rights, specifically concerning the fifth freedom traffic rights, because the fifth freedom traffic right is the right that has the possibility to the airlines to do cabotage between the different countries in Africa. Mm-hmm. So it's important to have this capacity to do cabotage between the different countries in Africa, because like this, we will see how the new routes will appear.
Thank you. So we saw the perspective on the regulatory and more macroeconomic perspective. We talked about the importance of infrastructure, of levering up the levels, the development and the quality of the airport's infrastructure. What is the main points that should be developed by these African airports to have more traffic on their sites?
Well, in my opinion, the key point is to try to diversify the activities. At the moment, the airports have as a main activity the activity of transport. But we can see that on the other countries around the world, like Asia, especially in Southeast Asia, you can see how the airports have other activities such as commercial activities, real estate activities, or advertising activities. No? So I think it's the moment to diversify the activities of the airports. The fares or the charges is one possibility, but of course we have to see how the airports in Africa develop other activities regarding commercial, regarding the real estate, especially the real estate with the creation of airport cities is an example. So we will see how this will be a real opportunity for the airports in Africa.
Well, that's a point where our other experts in the panel can bring added value. Karim Palmieri, who's he's partner of Quadrant, a multi-sector advisory firm that works with infrastructure development, special economic zones, and disruptive technologies with the relevant stakeholders of the emerging countries, has a lot to bring to the table. Karim, in your field and in the recent years, you've been involved in transactions and operations with the relevant stakeholders of this industry. What are the activities that, as mentioned by Oscar, could bring added value, could bring also a better quality of infrastructures to the African market?
Thank you, Jadid and Oscar. I think between the both of you, you've covered most of it, so I'll see if I can add a little bit of color. Sorry, so in a lot of the work that I do, working on special economic zones, the development around like specific economic activities, airports are really sort of very interesting. I think over COVID, some of the kind of highlighted, both on the cargo side and on the passenger side, what the extreme trends could look like. So I think, and Oscar, please correct me on this, on the passenger side, you saw a massive slowdown, and so an opportunity to kind of transform. How do you streamline? So like the pause allowed for quite a lot of kind of the opportunity for innovation. I think that's that was a point that you touched on with kind of low-cost carriers, is kind of the re-emergence of this passenger flows. From my understanding, passenger flows are expected to hit I think 100% of pre-COVID by about 23, 24. In Africa, it's a little bit slower, but like most African stories, it's kind of the growth path is very, very interesting. So I think that's going to be kind of opportunities in that space. On the cargo side, I think it sort of very acutely pointed out kind of that we need to move from sort of basic cargo to actually kind of more kind of, let's say, high-grade cargo. So-called storage and the development of kind of more evolved special economic zones around airports. And that goes for both kind of the passenger side and the cargo side. In terms of sort of investment opportunities, again, I deal much more on the infrastructure side as opposed to kind of on the airline side. So, and in that, you see and you can look beyond just the airport activity. So the kind of cross-revenue stuff, the traditional things such as some real estate, storage, then some logistics that are kind of traditionally around the airline industry. Now you kind of see, and I very much like the topic of kind of moving what we used to call sort of city ports in maritime, in the maritime context, which have grown and improved these abilities to do. In Africa, you can now see kind of the transition into airline cities or airport cities. Right, and sort of the concept of airport cities is fascinating. If you look at it as previously you sort of arrive at your airport and you kind of need to go into the city. Today, the special economic zone model includes very much logistics, manufacturing, residential. So now we look at integrated zones, so special economic zones are evolving, as you say, sort of conferencing, et cetera, but also very sort of pure kind of working spaces. So you see co-working spaces, even sort of high-grade residential hotels, hospitality. And that, that sort of opens up the kind of the investment opportunity to anything that you would look at on a general hub, on what you might call, and sort of major hubs on one aspect, but what's interesting for me is kind of the greenfield opportunities. So you've moved from saying, well, look, I can expand this airport, which is very interesting when you look at sort of major airports, the flows there, et cetera. Kenya or Ethiopia doing great things. But for me, what's a very interesting trend is the move from kind of large scale, large volume to kind of the more regional expansions. So now you see, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong again, the development of relatively small hubs, right, in smaller cities, which grow on a greenfield basis. And that allows for kind of leapfrog opportunities, kind of other trends in the Africa story, where you can really implement innovation. So when you say, you can follow some of the European trends, or kind of, let's say, American, kind of the traditional hubs, in my view, what you have the opportunity to do is say, well, look, I can take the best practices, the best technologies, implement them on a greenfield opportunity, and then sort of build around that. And there you have kind of, from an investor perspective, kind of a couple of factors that are, in my view, quite encouraging. I think you have a lot of support from kind of the international flows, so increased in Africa, into Africa flows, which is a very well-established and well kind of supported trend. So everyone is investing heavily into the ability to build this infrastructure. Everyone is very strongly for kind of low-cost carriers, increasing kind of traffic. The underlying of that means that you have kind of large African investment institutions. I think AIM is investing about $22 billion just on base. I saw that as a recent figure, so that's new to me as well. But what that means is you're saying, well, look, here's a pool of capital. Here's the existing ability of public sector capital to kind of look at different opportunities, more innovative interactions, and it then lays the groundwork for the presence of private capital. In my view, and sort of, I guess from kind of where I come from as an investor, the ability to welcome private capital tends to be the primary catalyst. I mean, it tends to kind of take you from, here we're moving on a government path, through to sort of moving on a kind of private capital speed, which tends to be far more accelerated. One of the last points that I think is quite important, and you sort of learn from the global picture onto the African picture, is I think globally you look at sort of, again, these are figures that I'm trying to pin down. If you look at sort of the global figure, I think it's about 40-50% of private capital alongside public capital. I think in Europe it's even better than that. So you've seen kind of a lot of concentration for that. In Africa at the moment, it's about 10-15%, I think, depending on markets. And again, that's kind of if we manage to unlock liberalization, if you manage to unlock the ability of private capital to come in there, you can imagine sort of the gap becomes kind of, are we catching up to even 50%? Even if we go to 10, 20, 30%, you've now tripled the amount of capital coming into that space. The last part is the ability to innovate. Digitization, everything that's happening, best practice, even sort of being able to build innovative hubs around aeronautics, et cetera, even kind of beyond that for a sort of sit on a city infrastructure basis. So that's kind of a space. For me, it's fascinating, and I've been spending more time with it and very excited about it.
So you mentioned 3 points. I'll challenge you on the first one. The introduction of private capital into the improvement or the development of the air transport infrastructures or services is key. Most of the international financial institutions, or the AIIM, as you mentioned, which is the African Infrastructure Investment Management, which is a fund created to invest in infrastructure assets around Africa. The AFDB, which is the African Development Bank, or other key players of the infrastructure financing sector, create a relationship between the feasibility of the project with the involvement of the private sector. How do you see these private-public relationship being created in Africa, in this industry or in others?
I think there are a number of, and this is going to be sort of relatively broad, I think there's a number of, per market, the type of public-private partnership that occurs tends to kind of, you find the best practices or where that's ended up. And it also kind of builds into sort of the ability to structure special economic zones in order to bring that flow of capital in. I think AIM, AFDB, et cetera, have their way, or they've been doing this for a while, so they'll know each market. But again, something I wanted to look at is that you'll look at sort of the major infrastructure tickets. So when we say sort of $22 billion, that establishes the sort of bedrock for putting in base infrastructure. Then you sort of say, and I guess this is where your work is, the design, the innovation, like how appealing these airports are. For me, some of the investment opportunities that are quite exciting is on the sort of smaller scale, when you kind of tap into innovation. Before, if you want to serve, let's say, a sort of major airport, you're looking at a big ticket, right? Now, if you're talking, well, look, I'm starting a greenfield airport, the capital expenditure, the initial capital expenditure is smaller, so it's a subset of investors, but a lot more appealing, a lot more fast-moving. So I'm quite excited about those little hubs that then over kind of something that the AFDB may say, well, look, this is a major airport, we'll put in infrastructure. It's kind of the side innovation vehicles that I think, you know, that's going to be a fascinating space. Sorry, I know that's kind of sidelining on your question, but I guess the answer is the ability to build these innovation hubs and within the airports. And so the programs that support that.
Well, that takes me to the second question. Can you give me practical examples of best practices being implemented in the African continent? And I'll look at Oscar now.
Yeah, of course. When we travel to Africa, and this is my personal experience, I had the opportunity to visit sometimes Morocco. And in Morocco, there is a public company, a public agency, which name is ONDA, that manages the airports in the country. I think Morocco has a good network of airports, has an important airport. The most relevant airport is Casablanca. Casablanca is, in my opinion, is an interesting experience because it's a regional hub for the Northern Africa. I think probably is a hub for all the continent. And also Morocco has an airline, Royal Air Maroc, with an important development, with an important route network. So I think in conclusion, Morocco is a good experience in terms of the air transport market.
What about?
I mean, look, I think it's interesting when you look at sort of we talk about the major hubs and the major connectivity of Africa, that sometimes that story isn't quite as prevalent. Personally, I think Morocco has the opportunity to innovate on so many different levels. Today, if I'm going to go out on a limb here, but I think a lot of the aeronautics being developed in Morocco is sort of parallel to sort of Europe and the US. There's strong ties there, so you see kind of this sort of high-grade innovation that you may not see. I think sort of the ability to be almost a super logistical hub. I mean, I think maritime, as well as the connectivity of, I think, the Royal Air Maroc, allows for the sort of links with things which are best practice from the Middle East. I think the Middle East is sort of groundbreaking on every aspect. They do, I think, tenfold the amount of cargo that the whole of Africa does, which is fascinating, just through 2 airports. And so you have those close ties, which allow you to kind of sort of say, well, look, how do we, again, leapfrog certain aspects or certain learnings? And then there's a lot of things, I think, on the tourism side. You have kind of Marrakesh as well, which has not just the volume, but the ability to kind of sort of see what works, like implement new technologies, et cetera. So yes, I'd agree with you that Morocco is a fascinating space.
Let me just to introduce a topic. I think the big question at this moment, and we can continue with this example of Morocco, I think the big question is how Royal Air Maroc, as a public company, national flag carrier, will compete with other companies such as Air Arabia Morocco, Air Arabia Maroc. Because this is an example that this situation that we will see how traditional airlines have the necessity to adapt its activity to the new competitors like the low-cost carriers. So this is a question, in my opinion, an interesting question, how the traditional airlines will compete with the low-cost carriers, with new operators that will appear in the next years.
The fact that we are moving in a globalized world where interactions with global airline companies such as EasyJet, Ryanair, who are taking a share on the African air transport market, makes the issue for national airlines a priority to deal with. And that's a point that the African airlines, national airlines companies have to deal with. The question I'll ask you now is that, given the reality and the historical bankruptcy of national airlines companies that were too protected by their governments, how these governments are dealing with the new reality, and how they can create an ecosystem that makes the national airline not disappear, but still take the maximum added value that they can from the growth that these global players on the air transport market could bring to the continent.
Interesting question, and difficult to answer this question. We have an example. The most clear example is Europe. In the past, the flag carriers in Europe were all public companies, okay? Airlines such as Iberia, Air France, British Airways were public companies. But the states, the governments, have not the capacity to finance the activity of the public companies at this moment. So I think the privatization of the public airlines in Africa is a real necessity. So the capacity to attract private investors in order to assure the continuity of these airlines. If not, the competition with the low-cost carriers is very difficult, in my opinion.
And linking this survival of airline companies with what they're actually doing as best practices, such as Ethiopian or Royal Air Maroc, or even Kenya Airways, who are the three, with the South Africa Airlines, the 3-4 main players in the African continent right now, the diversification of their services, which is something we touched at the beginning of our roundtable, and that's something we can link also to the innovation that could happen not only on the infrastructure side, but also on the services part. So how do you see Karim, these airline companies could play a role on the innovative way of seeing the air transport market in Africa?
Projecting how the airline market is going to sort of evolve is something that I haven't really looked at from an infrastructure perspective. I think I've seen more and more actually sort of raw infrastructure funds looking at kind of buying fleets. So they no longer see and sort of long lease assets just to sort of follow and kind of capitalize on that Africa story. I think if I'm looking at this from a kind of not trial basis, but if you see kind of governments, even kind of Morocco, saying, well, look, we have our national airline. This is the dynamic given the kind of geopolitical situation, what's shifting in Europe, like Brexit and all sorts of fun things, and the kind of need from Africa. You would then say, well, look, this is what the national airline is doing, and at the same time, you kind of have the growing presence of kind of the low-cost carriers, which are sort of working into that. If that's a slow progression, again, airlines is not kind of my core field, but as long as I think, as long as those two can work in tandem, and in some markets they're able to. I think Morocco is a pretty good example for that. Then the model will evolve, right? So the services will naturally kind of fall aside, and whatever kind of works with those both passenger and kind of cargo needs. Do you need kind of more automated cargo needs? What do passengers want? We'll see.
Let's wrap up with a last question that I will throw, and hope I will have an answer from both of you. What would be your key recommendations for the development, as you mentioned, on the innovative part in the African airport transport, and also on the airlines and air transport market as the conventional way we saw it? What would be your recommendations for the African to speed up its growth for the next years?
Yeah, firstly, I think the first recommendation is to say to the governments in Africa and to the airports and the airlines in Africa is see the Europe experience. See how Europe in the past created a unique market. And I think this is the real question that the African countries and the governments have up in the table, okay? So create the single market, see how Europe created in the past this market. The second recommendation, in my opinion, is try to liberalize the bilateral agreements, try to have less rigid bilateral agreements, because like this, you will offer the possibility to create new air routes and to appear new business segments like the low cost in Africa. I think these both recommendations, the creation of the single market and the liberalization of the bilateral agreements, are really important in terms to assure a future for the air transport market in Africa.
I think from my perspective, if you look at it, let's say if a lot of those initiatives come to pass and you say you have all these flows through, is that there's a real opportunity to sort of build and capitalize on things such as special economic zones. I think the ability to sort of say, well, look, we're going to structure this ecosystem, capitalize on sort of best practices. I mean, Europe is kind of sort of restrained in that, right? As a market, you can't sort of start building special economic zones everywhere. But in European market, in African markets, rather than wait for the whole country to kind of catch up, there are special economic zone structures that allow you to sort of create this pool where you can replicate these models, and then to integrate, to do the best practices in that sort of integrated zones, build those cities with this ability to innovate. I think you could probably replicate the European market quite quickly. Sorry about that for Europe, but yeah.
So, I really like this comparison between the inspiration from the European experience and compared to the not inspiration from Europe, and to try to see other experiences that are closer to the African continent, which is a greenfield industry for them. It's not a transformation needed. It's a creation from scratch or from nothing to being a hub or being a major player in the region. Comparing, and that's the strength that I think Africa could have for the next years, is to bring those two experiences, being close to Europe through the North African countries, and being close to Middle East through the East African and the Arab world, could bring a great new experience for Africa to speed up its growth. Well, I think we covered all the topics. Thank you for your interventions.
Bueno, fantástico. Hemos conocido muchas cosas. Realmente preguntábamos al principio, le preguntaba a Jalil Slimani, ¿Realmente el mercado aeroportuario africano es terreno de oportunidades? Bueno, hemos visto que sí. Yo he hecho una lista, primero de retos y luego de oportunidades, que voy a repasarlas. Si me dejo alguna, me ayudáis. Hemos empezado diciendo, lo decía Jalil, hay una falta enorme de infraestructuras en África y esto ya es una gran oportunidad. Vamos por los retos. Lo hemos repetido varias veces, sobre todo Óscar Olivé. Nos ha quedado clarísimo que hace falta un mercado único aéreo africano, decía, ¿no? Que los políticos observen a Europa, que nos miren lo bueno, el vaso medio bueno, el medio vacío, también tenemos mucho por hacer. Esto es muy importante, es un reto importante y también liberalizar esos acuerdos bilaterales, nos decía, porque son muy rígidos en algunas regiones y eso impide, por ejemplo, que lleguen oportunidades como la presencia de low cost, que ahora es muy reducida y bueno, en los próximos años se prevé que aquí haya grandes oportunidades. Sigo con los retos. Decía Karim, aplicar los servicios con zonas económicas especiales. Nos hablaba de este nuevo concepto, esta evolución del concepto de aeropuerto a ciudades aeroportuarias, donde pasan muchas cosas, ¿no? Aparte del almacenaje, la logística, donde se crean eventos, coworkings, hoteles, incluso restaurantes de lujo, y nos comentaba experiencias como, por ejemplo, las de Kenia o Etiopía, ¿no? Donde ya están aplicando este concepto de ciudades aeroportuarias. Y otro reto, hay que atraer al capital privado que invierta, ¿no? Hasta el 30%, estaría muy bien. Yo diría que hay que seducir a ese capital privado para que invierta en el sector aeronáutico. Vamos con las oportunidades, ya lo hemos dicho, compañías low cost, ideas low cost, África es una gran oportunidad para vosotras. La creación de nuevas rutas, faltan nuevas rutas que conecten el interior de África, ¿no? Comentabais que para ir a algunos sitios hay que hacer grandes vueltas, ¿no? Y eso, la creación de nuevas rutas puede ser muy interesante. Diversificar también las actividades que se realizan en los aeropuertos. Esta es otra gran oportunidad, actividades de marketing, de muchas cosas más. Pasar de las grandes volúmenes a las regiones pequeñas, ¿no? Nos lo comentaba Karim, qué importante es estas expansiones regionales, donde aquí puede haber también para nuestros emprendedores y emprendedoras y también para los inversores grandes oportunidades. Gracias a los tres por abrirnos, ¿no? Bueno, abrirnos los ojos, ¿no? y la mente también hacia África, ese continente que tenemos tan cerca, tan grande, tan lleno de oportunidades y que a veces es el gran desconocido. Gracias por acompañarnos en BNEW Mobility y nosotros seguimos porque tenemos muchas cosas por contaros. Dentro de unos minutitos, en la segunda sesión de este jueves, vamos a seguir en el aire porque estamos muy bien. Vamos a explorar las megatendencias en la movilidad aérea urbana. Yo creo que vamos a hablar de drones, no sé por qué, pero eso lo veremos dentro de un ratito en esta otra gran aventura. Hasta ahora mismo.
Fabricamos talento, fabricamos innovación y, cómo no, sostenibilidad. Fabricamos una nueva economía y un mundo nuevo, en 3D, por supuesto. Pero sobre todo, fabricamos futuro. Y es que fabricamos empleo para más de 137.000 trabajadores. Fabricamos oportunidades globales de negocio en un espacio de más de 10 millones de metros cuadrados. Y fabricamos servicios de vanguardia y ventajas competitivas para más de 175 empresas. Consorcio de la Zona Franca. Fabricamos oportunidades para tu futuro.
Welcome to D-Factory, the factory that develops talent, technology, innovation, and of course in the heart of Barcelona. After all, D-Factory is consolidating Barcelona as a European capital of development for Industry 4.0, for digitalization, for transformation, creating 1,500 direct jobs and 5,000 indirect jobs in the city, close to the metro, the harbour and the airport. And promoted by the Consorcio de la Zona Franca de Barcelona.